Good evening. On behalf of the FLENJ board, I would like to welcome you to FLENJ's third web chat for educators for the 2018-2019 school year. This evening's web chat is entitled Assessment in the World Language Classroom. My name is Dana Pilla, and I will be facilitating this evening's web chat. Our web chat series is a professional development offering to the world language education community. FLENJ's webinars are designed to bring important ideas and conversations to our members through the experts on our board and in our field. Please note that the audio and video of this webinar will be recorded. I'll provide you with details about how you can access the on-demand recording at the end of the web chat. This webinar is scheduled to last an hour and will be run more like an informal discussion among the participants and facilitator and presenter. If you'd like to ask a question of the presenter during the webinar, feel free to use the audio feature, or if you feel more comfortable, the chat feature on the sidebar. The presenter or facilitator will address your questions as you ask them. Take advantage of this opportunity to dialogue directly with experts in the field. As a registered live participant, you are eligible to receive a certificate of attendance stating that you signed up for and logged into this webinar. Details on how to receive this will be shared at the end of the webinar. FLENJ cannot guarantee any professional development credit for this webinar for those watching this video on demand at a later date. FLENJ is unable to grant a certificate of attendance. All participants are encouraged to work with their immediate supervisor to determine how best to receive credit for this professional development opportunity. In the event of technical difficulties, please remain connected to the webinar as you are able. FLENJ will contact you directly if the problem cannot be resolved. You may also email us at dpilla@flenj.org, but please understand that it is sometimes not possible to check email and run the webinar simultaneously. Thank you for your time and attention to these messages. And now let me take this opportunity to introduce you to our presenter, Laura Sexton. Laura teaches Spanish in North Carolina, where she has experimented with project-based learning and different assessment strategies over the years. You can learn more about what worked and what didn't on her blog, pblandtl.com, and you can also follow Laura on Twitter at Senora Spanglish. She's got a ton of followers. Laura, welcome to our webinar.
Hola, Dana.
All right.
How you doing?
Should I share your screen, Laura?
Yes, let's see what I can do.
Let me get Laura's screen up. Okay. Here you go, Laura. Making you the presenter now.
Alrighty.
All right. So
let's see.
Right now it should waiting to view Laura Sexton's screen. There it is. Okay.
Hooray.
Participants, feel free to use the chat feature, and Laura, you can get started.
Alrighty. So today I'd like to talk about assessment in world language, and a couple of things that I've tried over the years, kind of the alphabet soup of assessments. And so the first thing that we're going to start off with is just a rundown of, well, what we're expected to do. So all these assessments have to do with performance and proficiency. I'm focusing mostly on the formal type assessments, more of the summative than the formative. But if you think about it, if we're on a proficiency scale, everything that we're doing is kind of formative in a sense, because we're always trying to reach that next level. So I try to set up assessments in such a way that students have something to aim for, and that 100% might be 100% now, but down the road, like, they'll have to keep improving. They'll have room to keep going. And if we have time, we'll take a look at some of the tools that I use to help practice along the way before we get to the assessments. So that being said, straight to the alphabet soup. So the assessment ABCs, I'm starting off with IPAs because I suspect most people have heard of integrated performance assessments before, and I'd like to touch on those first. Then I'd like to lead into my favorite, which is the Apple test, which is an assessment that ACTFL puts out, and one that I have attempted to imitate the last couple of years with pretty good success, I would say. And then I would also like to bring in the STAMP, which is what my current district uses, which is a test along the lines of the Apple test, but it's structured a little bit differently, and so it might be a little bit easier to grade. It might also be a little bit harder to set up in some ways. So those are the things I'm going to talk about, and if you guys have any other kinds of assessments you want to talk about along the way, then we can do that. Right. So integrated performance assessments is what IPA stands for. and it has to do with the three modes of communication, and it could be set up with both interpretive reading and listening or one or the other. I usually did one at a time when I was doing IPAs. Um, and I like to go in the order of interpretive, then presentational, and then interpersonal, but I know a lot of people do it other ways. On the left here, you can see kind of screenshots of what my interpretive and my presentational assessments would look like for the students. I have the Apple scales on there, even though this is not necessarily the Apple test format. And basically what I did is I had students look at different texts. I would pick out a text that was appropriate for their level and then have them pick out the main idea and pick out just as many phrases, words, sentences as they could and tell me what they meant. Just straight up copy and then put it in English. And you can see the main idea part on the left here. And for the writing, I would give them a topic. Sometimes I would give them multiple possible topics related to the overall theme. So like if we were reading about schools, then I might give them some topics about like how can you help the schools and stuff that would relate to the project that we were working on. And so that's kind of how my templates look for those. The interpersonal kind of varied, and I did it different ways along the way. But here's sort of an example, a breakdown of an IPA that I did one time. And I have a video in here of a school in, I believe it was Honduras, where she was describing her setting. And that had to do with a lot of stuff that we had been researching up to that point. We had been researching a school in Colombia where I had contacts. So there's a lot of overlap in the vocabulary. So they interpreted that using the main idea and the what did you hear, what did it mean kind of things. It's a little bit harder to copy there. I'll talk about some tools you could use to do that there. If you're interested in the presentation itself, then you should be able to click on the link or see the link on my, or look up the school comparisons on my blog and find out more how it's broken down there. For the interpersonal, I did a couple different ways when I was doing integrated performance assessment. Sometimes I would just give them the topics and like send them out in the hall 2 or 3 at a time with an iPad and have them record and submit a discussion for that. I found that those tended to be presentational when it was said and done, and that they weren't so much conversations, that they were scripted most of the time. So then I kind of shifted to teacher interviews, and from there I've kind of shifted into group discussions which we'll talk a little bit more later with more of my Apple things. But either way, I was
Laura,
trying to
can I
see what
ask
they
a
could do off the
question
top of
really
their
quick?
head. Okay, doke.
Okay, the video that you have here, was that your interpretive text or was it a reading?
It was an interpretive text. It was
Yeah,
so it was a listening
right.
exercise, and
This
I
is how you
trimmed it
started
down.
it. Like this was your base. So the video was like your base for the IPA.
Right,
Okay,
right.
got it.
Although the project was kind of the overall theme,
Hmm.
because we were talking about sending school supplies to the school in Colombia,
Hmm.
and this was another school that needed help. There was in Honduras, and so we're like, so what can we do to help schools in general?
Okay,
Was kind of the topic that we were headed for.
got it.
And so it was leading up to a presentational kind of inspiration thing to like get other people involved in helping other schools. And so you can see the template that I gave them where they would draw a picture for what they were trying to say to kind of support their novice language if they were still at that level. Just write what they were going to write in Spanish in there and what they would do as a voiceover for each little piece there, so that they had something to, they could use visuals to communicate and also limited language if they needed to, but they could also use sentences to demonstrate a higher level. And that was what they did for their presentation, like help this school kind of add. That makes sense. So, yeah. So, and that's pretty much how IPAs would go for me. I didn't always use videos, of course. A lot of times it was infographics, and if I use infographics, it was really good when they were inside an article, because I'm sure you guys have had that situation where you had native speakers mixed into your class. So like they could take stuff out of the article to show their level, and the kids who were struggling could just pick the individual words and phrases that they could from the infograph. And so there was a little bit of something for everyone that way. The video is a little bit more challenging, and I had to pare it down a little bit, and that was one they struggled with. But yeah, so there were different ways to set the scene with the interpretive. Are there any questions about the IPAs at this point?
I have a question for you.
Now that I figured out what the chat windows.
You know, I'm full of questions.
Go for it.
I want to know timeline. So when you start your IPA and you start it with the video, or you start it with your interpretive text, whether it's a video or a reading, and you move on to interpersonal and presentational, do you do them all in a row? If so, how many days? If you don't do them in a row because you have an A/B schedule, how long does it take to get through the whole IPA in your experience if you have a class of 30 students?
So when I was doing IPAs, I was not on the AB schedule. I still had 90-minute blocks, but they were semester long. And when the classes were under 25, I could usually get through most of it in a day, because while I was pulling kids aside, or while kids were going outside the room to do their interpersonal part, the other kids would be distracted working on their listening or their reading or their writing part. So the kids were like a little bit less self-conscious about the people listening to them, you know? And so under 25, I could probably get it into 90 minutes. But when it was over 25, I usually had to plan to have a couple of days to do it and have other stuff for them to work on afterwards. Like I also did portfolios at the time. So if they finished with the IPA part, then they would launch right into the portfolios, keep busy, and not snicker at their friends who were in the throes of interpersonal assessment.
Yeah, that's always a distraction. I mean, my biggest problem when I had big classes in middle school doing IPAs was the interpersonal, and I ended up also sending them into the hallways with iPads because it just took quicker
Mm-hmm.
than the teacher interview.
Yeah.
Because when I had classes of 31, sometimes it would take me two full class periods of 45 minutes to get all the kids done.
Oh yeah, for sure. And now that I am on the AB schedule, and I've modified it now, and we'll talk. I've got more about that in the Apple section. But
Mhm.
I do small groups with me so that I can grade it, because I'm afraid of going through the recordings and spending too long to get them their feedback. And
Mhm.
so I still do it in the class, and it will take me. So I've got one class that's not finished yet, and that's my largest. That's about 34. And but like the classes that are at 30 or so, they're pretty much wrapped up within two class periods. And
Mhm.
usually I've only been spending about an hour tops each class period to get through them. So
That's
and
not
and
bad.
it's been a challenge to keep them busy and not staring at each other while we do that, and also like keep tabs on everybody. But they are able to get their feedback immediately, and I am able to get things in the grade book a lot quicker that way.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Does anyone else have questions for Laura on interpersonal before we move on? All right.
Okay. So the next thing that I moved into is Apple, and I stole a lot of things that I use from there. One thing that I have to be careful to do is explain the Apple levels, which I did use on the IPAs as well. And some people are bothered by the Apple levels because it breaks them down into further breakdowns. So like instead of just novice low, mid, and high, uh, novice low is N1, and then mid could be either N2 or N3, and then high is N4, and then beyond that is intermediate, and it goes all the way up through 5. And so I had these little notebook things that I made for them where they could see the levels and see what grade they would get for each. And when I was in the semester long setting, it was pretty easy each 6 weeks to make each 6 weeks its own scale. Like for 6 weeks, if you give me any Spanish at all, you pass. And then it was 50%. And then it was, or no, actually, I think in Spanish 1, for 6 weeks, it was a C. And then the next 6 weeks, it was you pass. And the last 6 weeks, it was only 50% if all you could give me was individual words like see and no and football. So I've altered it slightly. The babies do help a lot with them. I tried to do it without the babies this year, and I regret it a lot. I just tried to do it with a cone that you see on the left, and it works to a fair amount, but I think the babies would have helped them a little bit more. And like the kids like talking about the babies, and they refer to themselves as diaper babies or as walking babies or whatever, and they feel, and it gives them a language to discuss what they're doing. And even though it's not perfectly aligned with the actual proficiency levels, I like how it breaks down so they have room for growth once they exit the diaper baby stage, and so like they can kind of see growth within the novice mid, which can last quite a while. But so it's really important to break that down and to give them a language to discuss with each other, like their development and their growth, so that they could do that. And then one of my favorite things is when some of my students started using that's so novice high if you as an insult when they were in Spanish too. So like they got it and they used it and they were thinking more in terms of novice and intermediate. And that's what I want them to do. And so by doing that more explicitly with Apple, I found that was helpful. But how that ended up looking for them on the Apple imitations that I made, it's kind of like this. So here you can see on the left side, sample reading Apple, and then on the right side at the bottom is the sample listening Apple. And basically what I discovered about how the Apple was set up for interpretive was that there's matching, and then there's like picture to word matching, then there's word to word matching, and then there's multiple choice that's in English with longer text. And I thought it broke down as like novice low, novice mid, novice high, intermediate low, intermediate mid, intermediate high. But apparently it was more like novice, intermediate, advanced. And my kids said that I graded 10 times harder than the actual Apple assessment did, which works out nicely for me. But so I was asking them to do advanced, intermediate things. These were level 2 assessments here, and they were doing them and they were figuring it out and they were using their clues and do the performances. So we picked out topics mostly related to what we were talking about, but for the more advanced ones, to show their advanced levels, I would pick out things that were just random topics. Like one time it was Tide Pods, and then here I think we have the guy who invented the color TV, who's from Mexico, and just random things. Like, so the intermediate and the novice start out. We were talking about animals in that particular unit, and so I've got different pet care and dog show kind of things. And then with the listening, I use different videos. And matching some statements in English. It's not quite like the Apple itself, but it was a really easy thing for them to draw comparisons with. And you can see in the first set of videos, I had some ladies that helped me out. If you go to flipgrid.com/novice Spanish, there's a whole bunch of videos from teachers that are helping build a pool of novice Spanish, listing samples that are appropriate. Because one thing I like about the Apple is that they have samples that are accessible to novice learners, and I find that's a detriment in a lot of authentic listening, is that they just get so overwhelmed that they can't handle it and they just freak out and don't show anything that they know. In the second slide, you can see that I've got some videos from LATES, if you're familiar with those, from the LAITS in Texas. And I used some of those videos and had some matching things there. And then I would just go to YouTube and find stuff related to our topics. I believe the next one was actually like a dog that helped struggling readers. And so I had some matching pictures to answer questions in English. And then I had a multiple choice. Can't recall what that video was. But then at the end, another thing I like to do was have them evaluate where they think they are, so I could see if they really know what the levels mean and if they are focused on what they can do as opposed to what they can't do. So that's kind of what the interpretive side looked like for me. And the presentational honestly looked exactly the same. That I gave them the same kind of Apple score chart on the left and the topic at the top, and just room to write. And I gave them 3 topics so that if one topic didn't work for them, they would have a chance to prove it in another topic. Any questions about the interpretive Apple samples at this point?
Well, I have a comment. I think that it's great that you have a pool of resources to pull from, because that is a huge struggle for most teachers to find appropriate novice level interpretive listening and video.
Absolutely.
I know I used to spend sometimes an hour to find 1 3-minute video that was appropriate.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
so my question is, what was the address for Flipgrid? Because I'm going to put it in the chat section so people can see it.
Way ahead of you, Dana. So it's
Thank you.
flipgrid.com/novice Spanish, and anybody can use this. Now, I don't think anybody can download the videos because I had to do that in order to stick them in the Google Slides
Right.
for the students. But I mean, there's all kinds of screen capture things you could do with those, and I'm fairly certain that the teachers who helped build this stash would be more than happy to help other teachers in that way, because like this is for all of us to use,
Right.
and
It's a great
it's
resource.
exactly, it's free, nobody's getting paid,
No.
everybody has access.
And the U Texas one is great. I could post that, but I used to use that all the time because they have it split up by proficiency pretty well.
Yep. The one thing I've found recently is that the outfits are starting to get
They're
distracting.
really dated. I agree.
Yeah.
it's starting to get like, what? Like the kids look at it and you're like, oh, should I still be playing this? But they're so good.
Yeah. And it helps them get a feel for the pace because when we get to the stamp, they do not modify the text or the audio text for the listeners. They use straight up native speakers just talking. And I know a lot of our benchmarks in the district we get from Audio Lingua.
Mhm.
And for these presentations, for this format, I have to use videos, so I don't use Audio Lingua for these. But I know that my district does, and that's overwhelming for my students. And so I want them to like kind of ease into it with some novice things and then with some native speakers and then into more,
Right.
out in the wild kind of authentic resources.
Yeah, it makes sense to
Yeah.
ease them into it and to get them used to hearing that native speaker speech from when they're in Spanish one.
Yeah. And they felt a lot more confident having the bridge. Like I used to think that it had to be all authentic, authentic, authentic. And a lot of people feel that way, that it does have to be authentic for assessment. But I feel like the Apple is not set up that way because they do contract native speakers to do their recording, but they also script things pretty heavily, or at least they do the semi-scripted type of thing, so that native speakers are speaking more or less how they would, but it's still at a level that is accessible to novice learners. And so Apple does that. Other proficiency assessments, not so much. So
Okay.
that,
That's good to know. I didn't realize that the Apple exam did that.
yeah, yeah, and that's something that I miss a lot because my students felt a lot more confident having the bridge and like in my experience with authentic resources in the reading, you can find a lot of things that are just infographics that are accessible even when they're for native speakers by native speakers, but the listening, that's a whole other animal.
Hmm.
So now we
Perfect.
got these pools. All right.
Doesn't
Well,
look like
that is
any more questions.
it.
You can move on. Doesn't look like anyone else has questions.
All right. So I would like to talk about the interpersonal now. And I do small group speaking assessments these days. So I'm able to evaluate a lot of people at a time. I did this initially because students were crying during my teacher interviews. Like, I kind of had an iPad in their face. It wasn't in their face, but like they knew I was recording them because I wanted to have it for later. Um, I just had to abandon that so to avoid the tears. But also like they really felt like they were getting grilled. Some of my students now are saying they would rather it be one-on-one because they feel more self-conscious around their classmates. We might experiment with the teacher interview type thing again, but I like the small group speaking because it gives them a crutch, quite honestly. So what I have them do is I give them a bunch of blank slides. This was an example from a Spanish 2 student. I gave him blank slides and he picked out the pictures on his topic. This was from our self-improvement unit. And he put the pictures in there. I make them cite them. They had to do 10, and you could see 5 things that he wrote. And they put it in the speaker notes so they can't see it while they're presenting. But they have something that they know how to say. And they get all panicked, like, do I have to memorize this? I'm like, no, you don't have to memorize it. You just have to say something. Like, if he got in there and he said, dinero es bueno, then, I'm happy because he's got a sentence and it's like at least novice mid. And but it makes them feel better having something they could memorize. It also makes me feel better having something that I could see where they are before they try and tell me something. So like if they're going to Google Translate everything, I'm like, you're not going to remember it. And sometimes, you have to let them try to make them believers. And so they so they have something so they feel like they're not unprepared because like when I did the teacher interviews and I just threw random questions at them to see what they really could do off the top of their head, they were just minds blown. But with this, they do the presentation, take a minute or two to just say what they can about what they know, and then they take questions from the other people in their group. And while they're doing that, I have this little rubric where I'm keeping track of what they're saying so I can, without recording on an iPad, I could give them credit for what they say. And so the verbs are the main determiner for the sentences. So I like to have the high frequency ones there to circle. I make just little notes in the middle block. And then when they ask questions of the other people in their group, I write those down and I write down how they respond. And when they get into more intermediate levels, if they like keep the questions going, I keep track of that too. And then I just jot a little Apple score up in the Nivelle corner up there. And it's a really quick thing to do. So like lately with Spanish 1, I only had them do 7 slides and they had about 3 minutes total to present and then field questions. And so it was about 10 minutes per group, depending on the size of the group. And I would get there, I would keep track of what they could do while with their prepared stuff, and then not just with their prepared stuff, so I could get a range. And they didn't cry, so there was that. But they felt some of them do want to do more one-on-one with that, but I like how they have to do the spontaneous questions. And I did find also that to avoid the freaking out, I put some sentence stems, some question stems on the board, and I was like, if all you can do is ask "te gusta" something, that's kind of an N1 kind of question, and "es tu favorito" something, it's kind of an N2 kind of question, and then "puedes something bien," that's more of an N3, and if you could do all of them, then you're more N4 or I1, and they're like, okay, and they started to feel a little bit more confident that way. And some of the kids who were were going into it unconfident, when they had those, like, they were really stretching themselves a little bit more. So what I do with the groups is I try to go to them. It depends on how space is, when and where we are. Also, like where there's seating available. If they are like at the back of the room, or if they're in the middle of the room, sometimes I need to get them off to the side so I can still see everybody else. And a lot of times it is a big hubbub that I have to keep saying shh, shh, and that's annoying as heck, especially in the really huge class. But basically, I just like pick a group, and I try and pick the ones I think will be more confident first, or sometimes I just pick the ones that'll be smaller first, so that I can like get the as many groups covered as possible as soon as possible. But yeah, so mostly I just go to their groups to try and make them as comfortable as I can. Sometimes I will, if I have an empty table, I will call the group over. But I actually went through and like rearranged seating for that day according to their groups, so that I could just go sit with them and do that. There was a couple of questions I saw in there, but after the groups come to me or to go around the room. Yeah. Any other questions about the small group speaking? Okie dokie. So I guess we're ready to talk about the stamp. So here you can see one of my buddies from the link chats, and so I have a couple of resources. I have a YouTube playlist that I started where I did some Google Hangouts with some link chat homies, and I collected some videos there, and you should be able to access that online, but I don't have a handy link for that. But for the stamp, we try and use Master Connect in my district, and it's a place where they can record their answers online. They could do multiple choice. They could do other things, but the stamp is multiple choice for the interpretive. So you can see the kind of videos that I collected for them on the listening. The first one, I believe, was one of the novice Flipgrid novice ones. The next one was one of my language teacher buddies talking about video games. And then the next one was one that came from the stamp demo. And I'm not entirely sure about the legality of it, which is why it's not available to everybody. But I just kind of screencasted their video so that the kids could hear what it would actually be like and hear them freak out in real time about how fast they were talking about this random topic they were not prepared for. And then I got a YouTube video about the topic we were talking about. We were talking about homework at the time. And you can see that some of them I have 2 videos, and that's because I had one on YouTube, which is sometimes randomly blocked, and then I downloaded it and uploaded it to Google Drive so that it would not be blocked. So they had 2 options to view it, whichever would work. And then on the right, you can see like the actual document. I printed it out for them because if they can cheat, they will, because it's just too easy. So I make different versions, and I print it out so they don't, so they're not all sitting next to the person with the same version of them. Basically, I just mix up the answers, but they have the same text and they have different questions. So these are 2 samples for the reading. I got a voter registration form because, you know, I went to register to vote. It's like, hey, we can use that. And because they had different form kind of things on their sample one too. Then I asked them questions about some very basic things. They were multiple choice. They are in English. And I think, now, and this other one is also an example that I got from a random online example thing. And then I just asked them basic questions, moving up the levels. Stamp does not label the levels. I just do that so the kids know where they are. And what I've been doing is I've still been giving them an Apple holistic score based on what they've got. And it ends up coming down to like the 6 or 7 out of 15 questions is is an N1, I figure, and then 8 or 9 questions is N2, 10 questions is N3, 11, 12 is N4, and then 13 to 15 I call I1, because I have a novice low, novice mid, novice high, and an intermediate low sample so far in Spanish 1, and that's as far as I've gotten, because really novice high is what we're aiming for, to overshoot a little bit, but novice mid is the bare minimum to get out. And that's kind of what the stamps look like there. I do still do the small speaking groups, because they don't do interpersonal on the stamp test. They do presentational speaking, and so I have not gotten comfortable with that yet, but I have used Flipgrid for them to record their conversation, or not even a conversation, to record something that they have scripted for themselves. And yeah, and that's kind of how we go there. And their writing is very similar. We've been using the PALS rubric, but that's not necessarily that's not what they do on the stamp, but it's a way to give them feedback. I still use the same format that I used before. I just try to adapt the prompts to something that is a little bit more stamp-like. But the main thing is that they have an audience that they're writing to about a specific topic with specific guidelines that say Spanish. Yeah, I thought it was strange that stamp doesn't use interpersonal too, and I think that's partially because it's really really hard to imitate interpersonal, and like the Apple uses videos with like creepy people nodding along pretending that they can hear you, and there are advantages and disadvantages of that, but I tend to actually prefer that, but not so much in my district. But they do use presentational speaking and presentational writing. The OPIs are something that I have not dealt with yet, even for myself, but I think that would be a really valuable thing to do. I think if we were higher levels, we might do more with them. But I'm teaching strictly level 1 this year.
Yeah, the OPIC just goes up higher, but it's computerized. I'm doing it for my capstone course at Rutgers to get out of our program. So we really want to measure, their language proficiency. Hopefully every semester we teach it, but right now we've got a grant to do it for the semester. So I'm curious to see how the students do. I don't know. I've never taken the OPIC. I don't know if it's like the Apple or it's supposed to be interpersonal, but it's on a computer.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I know that Martina Bex had a post on her taking kind of a mock OPI, and I was very intrigued by how similar that seemed to like the Apple process of looking for what you can do and the scoring of that based on what I could tell from her post. So I don't know, I think we might be pleasantly surprised there too, but I don't know. It's an interesting one, but I do not have any experience with the OPI. I think that's generally regarded as the most accurate proficiency test. Yeah, so that's what I've got on the stamp test. And those are basically the summative assessments that I focus on. The next thing I have is some tech tools that you could use to prepare or incorporate into your assessments, performance assessments, or formative assessments. So before we leave the land of summative, is there anything that anyone would like to say or add or question? Alrighty. So I want to tell you about some of my favorite tools, some of which my children hate, and that's okay. They could still be valuable, and some kids actually like them, and I feel like they're very useful still. So number one, my fave is Edpuzzle. And you can see a little sample of an Edpuzzle I did on a video about Pachakacha or Pechakucha. That's when I came up with the speaking assignment where they had the slides. I was going to have them do a Pechakucha, and I just kind of evolved from that. But like they were learning about Pechakucha, and I interjected questions in between. Like you can add them onto the video, so to speak, and you can see how the questions look. I do them in English. I tend to have questions about like, what does this mean? I've tried experimenting this year with questions about like, what words did you understand? Like write down any words you understand, and they kind of freak out. I tried doing ones where like, which word means this, and they freak out a little bit. But I think my problem this year is I was picking videos that were a little bit too complex for the level I was dealing with. I always have that problem. Hopefully not next year, but like in the last several years, I've gone Spanish 1 first semester, Spanish 2 second semester, and then going back to Spanish 1 in the fall. I have to readjust to what is a reasonable thing to expect. But Edpuzzle, I really like how you can break it down into a bunch of tiny little things, and it's really easy to grade, and it's really easy. Like I project like how far they've gotten because it shows their progress and how many they've watched, and you can see how many times they view it, and it's just a lot of information for you to see where they are and what they need. And that's really my favorite, even though my kids this year hate it because I abuse them with overly complex videos. But yeah, the next one I have is Vivi is also for videos. I haven't touched that in a while because it got really wonky, and if the YouTube video is blocked, then you are out of luck. But I think it's a really useful tool. Like I use it to cut down videos, so like you can take chunks and you can add comments to the chunks and just like chunk the video, and it would just play the chunks you have. I did that with the school comparisons, and I liked it. The kids get frustrated with it mostly because of technological issues, not because of the program itself necessarily. Some do get confused. Like I wanted them to post comments of what they heard in English. They could highlight any part of the video, of the timeline of the video that they understood, and then put what it was in English. I thought that was perfect. Took a little bit longer to grade, harder to get the main idea thing on there. I made them put that in the description of the video, but that was kind of confusing to some of them. But like I feel like it really handles everything that you want to know about what they actually can understand if you can get all the stars and the firewalls to align. Um, but those are my two video listening kind of resources. Actively Learn is actually one that I usually tie with Edpuzzle because it's basically Edpuzzle but for texts. And you could take any text and from online, or you could upload something and you could insert questions. Now, if it's a PDF, you can only put the questions at the end. But if you take like an article or a blog or something like that, you could insert questions in between, like wherever you want. And they could be multiple choice, they could be short answer, however you want to do it. Yeah, stars and the firewalls. But Actively Learn is a handy thing. My kids were frustrated that this year again, I think because I started them off overly complex, which mea culpa. But if you get them started off with other things first. I started off with it too early in the year and I kind of ruined it for them. But I find it this useful thing to break down the text so it's not overwhelming to them. Yeah, and so that's my suggestion for reading. Adobe Spark, you can see a little sample here. That is my suggestion for interpersonal and presentational. Because I feel like a lot of when I had them doing the iPad videos in the hall, the worst experience for me was having to listen to those like whole minutes of silent, awkward confusion while they were deciding what to say. But with Adobe Spark, they can just record on individual slides. And I know that like in between they were discussing what they wanted to say, sometimes writing down what they wanted to say, which is why I don't use it for assessment so much. But it's a really good practice for the interpersonal because like so I had the interviewer write not write but like record themselves. They put their name, they typed in their name, they put their icon that represented them, or sometimes they just use their name, and they recorded what they wanted to ask, and then the next slide was the person's answer, and then they made another slide for that person to ask, and then just a slide for each piece, and that cut out a lot of the awkwardness and made them feel more confident and made my life a lot better. This also works really well for the presentational also when we did like the self-improvement things. A lot of kids felt more comfortable when they could put an icon or just their name or just their initials or something up on the video and just like record their voice without having to show their hair that they didn't do right that day or whatever, or without going to the bathroom to do their makeup or what have you. So it's really good for creating something a little bit more polished, but really, really quickly. And so they sent Flipgrids to like the kids in Iowa that they were having in their self-improvement support groups. And so that's something I recommend for practicing speaking. And then Flipgrid, of course, is one of my faves, not just for the listening with our little novice Spanish bank of words, of videos, but also for the communication, because I feel like it's really important to get our kids talking with people beyond the classroom so that they believe that other people use the language. I mean, on an intellectual level, they know it, but they don't feel it. until they're talking to somebody else in another language. Also, my kids last year, and well, in the previous years, they felt really good about themselves listening to other people because I don't know. I guess I hope it's a phase. I know I went through it where you're like, oh, I could talk better than that, or like you could hear their errors and feel good about yourself, and that was it's fun. They were a little more intimidated when they sent questions on Flipgrid to some kids in Peru, and then the kids answered, and they couldn't understand everything, but like they still were getting answers from kids in Peru. So that is just a really cool way to connect without having to align time zones and stuff, and to make the speaking real, whether it's presentational or interpersonal. And the last resource I would like to recommend is Seesaw. And you can see what one of my students did for her project, not so much for formal assessment. I actually do this after IPAs or apples or stamps or whatever. Once I get a feeling for where the kids' proficiency level is, I have them create a product that goes with the topic that we're doing. And so this one was for the visitor videos for the Peruvian students that were going to be coming to our community. And so, they don't have pelicans ice cream or pelicans snow cones in Peru, obviously. So like Abby wanted to tell them about that. So she took all her lines, and she was working with a partner. So she took just her lines, put them on a little note in Seesaw, and then recorded her voice. You can't really see the little recorded part, but it's on there. And she just clicked like she would have done on the Spark and just spoke her lines so I could hear if there were any major communication impeding problems. I didn't always have time for that. It was nice when we had a snow day to deal with that kind of thing. But they're there, and just having the kids do the practice is nice too, because then even if you don't catch every error, they have been through an extra step of the process for revision and for a little bit of self-awareness of where they might need to brush up on something. And I've been thinking about adding steps where they had to listen to how Google Translate says their lines and then repeat them, but I haven't fleshed that one out yet. But yeah, those are some of my favorite tools for preparing for assessment or for using for more formative type assessments. And that is basically all that I have. So, Dana, you got any questions, comments, concerns, or
Yeah,
anybody else?
I loved your presentation. I think that, um, I think the hard part about implementing the IPA is getting your school behind it.
Mm,
Get a mode of assessment that's acceptable at the school level, the administrative level. But once you get through that hurdle, it's just about preparing the students during class for
mm,
the actual assessment. And you have to do that by practicing the actual skills. So,
mm-hmm.
my question for you is on a normal day when you're not doing an IPA, what are the types of things that we would see in your classroom?
That kind of thing is in flux at the moment, but a lot of the things that I have used in the past had to do more with like the actively learn and ed puzzle type things, but also like student conversations. Like when they were doing the self-improvement, they would talk about what they have or haven't done that week, what they're going to do next. We do have notes. So like I do have. I mean, I do now. I do give them vocabulary lists because the district assessments come with vocabulary lists, and then we do different activities to interact with it and like build context around it. So like when we're talking about classes, we would be like, so is this class? Would you rate this class as fun or boring, as hard or easy? And then we would build on that and maybe have some quick PQA about that. That's a little bit tougher in the classes over 30, but but PQA is something that I relied on heavily with classes under 30 before the A-Day B-Day thing. PQA was a big thing. I used to do a lot more with stories, with the one-word image kind of stories, and my kids loved that last year and the year before. They get really excited about it, but I feel like not a lot of Spanish is happening in my classes this year. We play card games sometimes with Verba or Manzanas con Manzanas. We do some Duolingo now and then. We do some Senior Wooly now and then. In fact, when I was out with a headache recently, that they were doing Senior Wooly. We do a bunch of different things. And we just try and keep it kind of related to the topic or essential vocabulary, like the high frequency words. Yay, resources for teachers. Awesome, Frank.
Yes. So those are really great tips to get started with this in the classroom. Because I don't know all of our participants on here, but sometimes it's the hardest thing is just starting to go
Hmm.
towards this model when we've been stuck in a lot of districts in New Jersey on a traditional model for world language. So moving towards this research-based model that we know works, sometimes it's a huge
Hmm.
shift for a lot of teachers. So it's nice to know that you could start out small by maybe just using some of the tech tools that encourage real
Yeah.
communication, and just starting out with these little activities in class before you go into a full-blown IPA.
Hmm. Definitely. Or even, and I've attended presentations before, one that Nora Jones does, that's IPA every day, and like just having something for the students to respond to each day, even if you're not assessing them, like having something to spark conversation from the target culture. And I would like to move a little bit towards that myself, and just something where they are interacting with text and where they are responding to text and when they are using language to express themselves, I guess. So like even if you're not using IPA for assessment, you could use that kind of progression, because my colleagues say they try and hit each of the modes each day, and I think that's also a good thing to keep in mind when you're doing that.
Okay, great.
How's
Oh,
district?
Laura, Frank has a question. How's your
How's
handled the traditional? Is that the one you just did? No.
no, so I was just reading that. So the traditional final exams. So my district, I am teaching only Spanish 1, and our Spanish 1 exam now in my whole district is officially the stamp test. So that's out the window. But our benchmarks are still, despite having listening and reading and speaking and writing sections, are still, I would say, pretty traditional in the sense that they are built around the unit vocabulary. And so like the bridge between in the wild authentic proficiency and traditional thematic units has not been built per se. It's still under construction. And so our final exam is a proficiency exam for level 1. For level 2 and beyond, not so much. Um, we do not have IPAs, but I do know that Thomas Sauer's one that they called in, Greg Duncan's one they called in to help develop these assessments. So they have worked on incorporating more modes, even if they're still largely vocabulary based.
Hmm. They actually called in national people to help make the assessments. That's impressive.
Yeah, and I learned that the district I'm in now is like one of the top 10 largest districts in the country. So
Wow.
that's probably how that happens. And I've got like a rock star coordinator for departments too, actually. And
Right.
that's part of why I'm there right now. Is that they have these connections and they make these things happen, like, doing an actual proficiency test for the final. So like things are moving and shaking there. And people are cool with experimentation. They don't necessarily they everybody's doing their own kind of experiments in the classes, and that's something pretty cool about where I am.
That's great. Okay, team, we're going to wrap this up in about 5 minutes. Are there any other questions from our participants? You could also unclick your mute button if you'd like to ask Laura the question yourself. I, is Frank coming on? No. Yes.
Yes. Hi, Laura.
There's Frank.
Hi, everyone. I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, but you may or may not know I'm moving to a new district, and I did this already in my current district, and I'm just wondering if you have encountered a situation where there are teachers who are not really on board with the IPA model of assessment, and where there you are teaching and trying to be. Have you encountered that, and how have you maybe dealt with that or shared your knowledge or experience to try to pull them along? Anything that you would share with other fellow teachers or myself, like a supervisor, to try to plant the seeds of like, this is where we're going and how can you get people to move along with you?
So I have encountered that. I don't know if I have some useful advice for you at this point. Like since we have the stamp data, we try and start with that and go from there. Um, we also have the benchmark data and things like that. So that gives us some things we can work with so we can see where the needs are. Without that kind of data, there's not much to be done. I'm working on in my own district or my own setting, trying to come up with like the vision and like focus on what people want beyond the class. So that's something that I try and do like in my workshops and stuff, not necessarily where I'm teaching. And I've done a little bit of that in my past district, and we've talked about the proficiency levels, and some people are like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, but they still have a hard time breaking out of the way they've always taught or the way they were taught. And so one thing that I found that was my like eye-opening experience at ACTFL, not this past year, but the year before, was the proficiency levels of proficiency teaching. And that when you're novice low, you've got to have something to imitate, like, or you've just got to have some lesson plans you could straight up implement that you could just steal. And then you could have some that you can copy and adapt, and then you got to have some that you can like fill in the blanks. And it works a lot like your proficiency in a language. So I thought that was really eye-opening. But like as far as getting people to want to progress the proficiency scale, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a very personal kind of thing for everybody, you know.
Lisa had a question because you've done both. If you had to recommend one, would you do stamp or apple? You know, if the district had to pick one, because in New Jersey they can pick either for the seal of biliteracy.
Apple is absolutely my favorite.
I like it better too, but I didn't want to say that out loud. I just chatted it, but I didn't say it.
Well, and my district expert people who are my homies and my heroes, like they are not big fans of Apple, and I think they think that it is I think they think that it is inflated, and I don't think that's the case. I think that our expectations are inflated for what counts for each level, but also bearing in mind that it's a performance assessment and not a proficiency assessment. I feel like the stamp test, the listening is not accessible if they are not already intermediate. I feel like the presentational speaking is not a relevant skill. Like in North Carolina, we made a point of making interpersonal the number, like all the standards that are start with 1. And I just find it silly to not have to do presentational speaking in level 1. So I far prefer the Apple, but the stamp is perhaps more proficiency rather than performance oriented, I guess.
I've heard that the stamp, the one advantage is it has more languages that you can assess in, and for districts that assess the ESL students, like I think Michelle Schreiner uses the stamp. I don't remember Frank's. People on our board use the stamp, but I can't remember which school districts. But I know they said there's just more languages to choose from, so that could be a factor depending on what district you're in.
And I know the Apple has expanded a lot lately, so I don't know what languages they wouldn't have.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to look into it more, but I would prefer the Apple exam as well because I mean, I go to all their workshops. I was trained in how to give the actual OPI assessment, and I like the way the assessment is. So, oh, Lisa says that's what they're facing in Connecticut. The stamp has more languages. So, and it's easier to get the seal by literacy for the students that, for instance, speak Urdu or some rare Asian language.
Okay.
And that's probably why they use it. But I still think you could teach the IPA model and all of that and use the stamp. I mean, it's still gonna give the results that you want. It's not that you're changing your instruction to meet the test. Like they both assess the different skills. So
Yeah. I am less inclined to do the IPA, knowing that I'm leading up to the stamp because they have like those very specific multiple choice questions for the interpretive.
right.
And I used to like have it wide open, like what is it that you do understand? But I know that they're going to pick specific things, so I try and aim that way. Although my interpersonal and my presentational methods haven't changed a whole lot for it.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Laura, for this wonderful conversation. We are going to end our session now. Um, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this has all been recorded. The recording will be made available on request within a few days. Additional details will be sent out to you and to the general fund membership on how it can be accessed. For those of you attending as a registered live participant, after this webinar, we'll send you proof of attendance in the form of a certificate of completion. And in April, please join us for our next webinar on target language usage and authenticity of interactions with Nathan Lutz. I should say the famous Nathan Lutz, president of NEL and on the board of every language organization in the country. Just kidding, but he really is. For the remaining web chats of the year, you can go check out our website, FLENJ.org. And once again, thank you, Laura Sexton, for being our guest speaker today.
Thank you for inviting me, Dana. It's good to see some FLENJ friends on here too.
You know, we got your back.
Thanks, girl.